Laziness. It's something we've all heard or said before. How many times have you been told, don't be lazy in your life? How many times have you said that to yourself or thought that about somebody else?
I can't stand lazy people.
It's pathetic. Just stop being a lazy fat.
It is not good for you to lay in bed all day. It is not good for you to doom
The
scroll
more
for
that you force
hours
yourself
on
to
end.
do things that you don't want to do, the less you're going to be lazy and the more
Procrastination turns
motivated
into
you're
a
going to
daily
be.
cycle of laziness.
Laziness is one of those heavily thrown around terms, and it could be set with loving banter or be heavy with projected accusation. But what does it actually mean? In his book, Laziness Does Not Exist, social psychologist Dr. Devin Price explores how the word emerged in the Middle Ages in Germany from the word lazisch, to call someone feeble or weak. In Old English, it carries an even more moralistic meaning, to be false or evil. Today, laziness feels precisely like that. It's one of the most judgmental things we could say about ourselves or others. We are obsessed with everything connected to it, may it be procrastination, a lack of motivation, perfectionism, or a rise in ADHD. Laziness holds a mirror into what we find valuable as a society. And precisely because of that, we can learn a lot about it by looking at how it's been framed in history.
We think about laziness as a very individual thing that is part of someone's personality trait or even like genetics, but you can actually think about it on a more societal level.
That's Jonathan Yong Tienxhi, a researcher at Cambridge University. I approached Jonathan because he was looking into the roots of how laziness was being talked about in the country we both come from, Malaysia.
What we consider to be laziness is always going to be those who do not contribute as much to neoliberal capitalism.
I'm Miho Soon, and this is Money Trauma, podcast series revisiting the inner human experience of money and work, how it's been portrayed, and how misunderstood it is. In this episode, we are going to go through different parts of the world to explore tropes of how laziness is portrayed. We'll be speaking about it from a societal, psychological, and systemic level with 3 different guests, exploring questions like, who gets deemed as lazy most often? Why is it so hard to shake off? What does it have to do with our biology and how we respond to stress? And most importantly, if it isn't laziness, what is it? And how do we move out of it, both personally and collectively? This is a very special episode to me, as I got to go back home to challenge the stories I grew up with about my people. So let me take you to where I'm from. Malaysia is a very multi-ethnic country in Southeast Asia. It's comprised primarily of the Bumi Putera, Malay and indigenous groups, Chinese, Indian, and many other people from all around Asia and beyond. Growing up in such a place was incredibly interesting because diversity was a given. Walking on the streets of Malaysia, you'll see so many different kinds of people, see so many different religious symbols, and hear so many different languages being spoken. On the surface, it seems that everyone coexists together in relative peace. But when we look a bit deeper into how people feel about each other, it's also clear that there's so much more than meets the eye. I grew up with some deeply ingrained economic stereotypes about other races. As Malaysian Chinese people, we were taught that the native Malay people were lazy. And one day I just wondered to myself, where did this story come from?
The association of Malays with laziness really comes out in the 19th century, during the time of British colonialism.
Malaysia was colonized by many European forces, but one that had a lasting effect for our story today was from the British Empire.
Of the greatest importance in Kuala Lumpur, as everywhere in Malaya, are the Chinese. Roughly equal in numbers to the Malays, they completely dominate the country's economic life.
And the British Empire did what it did best, which was to divide and conquer through narrative, and racist narrative.
A couple of the people who really kind of entrenched it are like British residents and colonial officials like Hugh Clifford, he wrote that the Malays, they never work if they can help it. Frank Sutherland, he made observation that the leading characteristic of the Malay of every class is a disinclination to work. So yeah, it's a very damning and very like broad generalization.
In the 1970s, years after Malaysia became independent and British forces left, American economist Thomas Sowell found that Malaysians still believed in these stereotypes. When we talk to people today about how they feel about each other, these stories still shine through, even with the native Malays themselves.
A lot of Malays do accept the stereotype of the lazy Malay, but they draw kind of boundaries between themselves and the lazy Malays, right? And these boundaries are based around class and social background. So, if you have like three houses and you drive a nice car, that's a sign that you're not lazy, right? But if you, work in a working class profession or you work in a civil service, that's a sign that you are too complacent, too content in life, and that's why you're lazy.
Sound familiar to you? In the psychology of generalizations, there's always exceptions. Let's unpack the laziness story further. If someone was to frame another group of people to be lazy, it would, of course, always have to be in contrast with something else. To truly understand the trope of laziness, we have to look at its double, the hard worker. What I remember so distinctively is that in contrast to Malay people, I, the Chinese person, was supposed to be the hard worker.
So like there's another British colonial officer who very explicitly kind of like compared Chinese and Malays. He wrote that like not a single Malay can be pointed out to have been raised himself by perseverance and diligence. But when we turn to the Chinese, what a striking contrast he presented. They are the most active, industrious, and preserving of all.
This story of us being active and industrious isn't new, and it's really intense. Renowned Malay sociologist Syed Hussein Alatas noted how a British author wrote, Chinese workers were, quote, the mule among the nations, capable of the hardest task under the most trying conditions, tolerant of every kind of weather, eating little and drinking less, unlovable and useful in the highest degree. All around the world, the entanglement of productivity with the Chinese and or Asian identity is hard to escape.
These people aren't just rich, they're crazy rich.
Now, you really should have told me that you're like the Prince William of Asia.
That's ridiculous.
Cinema and TV hits like Crazy Rich Asians only come to celebrate those with newfound wealth.
So how do we do it? How did China transform from having one of the lowest GDP per capita?
China produces billionaires faster than any country in the world.
You've probably heard of the model minority story in the US, which is to say that there is a minority that is like a model that everyone else should aspire to be like, the Asians.
Universally successful, high-achieving, hardworking, and have essentially achieved some level of success that's unparalleled.
And through these stories, people tend to make this point that there's supposedly something almost biological that makes Asian people more hardworking, efficient, or intelligent, and thus making us richer. But these stories miss so much context about economic policy, history, and the fact that in those circumstances, people just had to do what they had to do to survive. And perhaps it was just what was the most favorable to the people who forced them to do so.
What the British considered to be lazy or not lazy is very much dependent on whether it was useful to colonial capitalism. So for example, the Chinese and Indian communities, because they come in as immigrant labor and they don't have like the option to, for example, own their own land and have agriculture, they were compelled to work in plantations and work in mines because of the circumstance they were in. Whereas the Malays, they did have the alternative, right? So they didn't have to submit themselves to, the kind of working conditions in plantations and mines, but you shouldn't complain about poverty if you're not willing to work, right? But of course, there's a structural reason for why you wouldn't want to expose yourself to the worst kinds of exploitative labor that comes with being an immigrant.
Today in Malaysia, it isn't like Malay people aren't working harder than the Chinese. It's that there's a significant split in whether they are involved in what we call highly skilled work or low-skilled work. In the past, it was what was most favorable to the British. In the present, from that legacy, it's what sectors are perceived to be the most favorable to GDP. And in the end, those are unfairly valued differently in the eyes of government and people, even though society depends fundamentally on what we call low-skilled work. What are the perceptions we have of essential workers? Is the manual laborer or hospitality worker not as productive as the consultant or tech CEO? What Jonathan showed me made me reflect so much about how little this narrative is actually ever challenged in Malaysia.
So in Malaysia, different resources are distributed based on how you're racialized, whether you're Malay or whether you're Chinese or Indian and so on. So Chinese elites will say that, like, oh yeah, of course I deserve my wealth because I work so much harder than the Bumi Putras. Right, and rich Malays can also say that, like, look, I'm an exception to that norm, right?
The Chinese, Indian, and other communities argue that the Malay government only favors Malay people, giving them social security and educational help while excluding the rest. And when you talk to people, you can hear this resentment. Beneath the stories of others as lazy, it's almost like I can hear a cry for help. Why is it so unfair? In other parts of the world, we can also find similar lines drawn between people to divide each other. If it isn't this political story, there's another big one about laziness that you might see used by politicians all over the West today.
And I think in the UK as well, there is this stigma of welfare recipients, right? And there is an ethnic component to that stigma, where it's like this idea that if you're a black family, you're living off welfare, that's a cultural deficiency that you have, right? And then you compare that to like other immigrants, like East Asian immigrants, they say like, oh, look, why can't you be like them? They're hardworking. Even though the social context is very different, you can still see how these stereotypes and like narrative and ideologies come into play to justify and rationalize how rewards are distributed across racial lines.
Economic productivity, or the perceived lack thereof, is used primarily as a justification for deservingness of help today, just like in Malaysia. When countries go through war or economic crises, austerity is often used. Healthcare system budgets, wages, social services are often cut while taxes are increased, in a climate where people are already struggling. This justification, as Clara E. Mattei critiques in The Capital Order, is that when countries need to step into financial conservation mode, it's always framed that the elites who have more money shouldn't be the ones to carry the burden. They are, quote, the rational savers, while workers are social liabilities, quote, based on their inability to practice virtuous economic behaviors. In other words, it's somehow the poorest people's fault that we've gotten into this mess, and so it's their burden to carry alone. One of the countries that was imposed with one of the worst measures of austerity was Greece during the Euro crisis. There's a stereotype that Southern Europeans, including Greeks, are lazier, living the la dolce vita life in the warmer parts of Europe, relaxing on the beach. But reality couldn't be more skewed. Greeks have the longest working hours in Europe, and its current government only wants to increase it more, proposing a 6-day work week while Northern Europe pushes to normalize 4. Beneath all of these conversations, what matters has always been and always is about resources. Who deserves those resources and who doesn't? The easiest story to justify these things has always been of who is more lazy and more productive. It's the unemployed, the single mother, minorities, or immigrants.
problems in the labor market, problems of unemployment.
These empty desks are dragging down the economy.
European Union countries can block jobless immigrants from receiving welfare benefits.
And the money has to come from somewhere.
If we were going to sit down and write a new immigration policy from scratch, we would not have one where immigrants use more welfare than natives.
I think immigrants in general are some of the most hardworking people, particularly because they're trying to prove their worth. And as a person that's trying to prove your worth, you are doing everything in your human capacity to not identify with that space. And sometimes that can actually lead to situations of burnout.
That's Tanya Master. Tanya is a career coach and therapist who works primarily with unemployed immigrants in Fired Up Space, an organization funded by the German Federal Employment Agency. Tanya works in Germany, where I am based too, where the conversations around unemployment and immigration have been taking center stage in our politics.
They are doing everything they can to survive, and they will do everything. They will climb that corporate ladder faster than everybody else. They will go from industry to industry. And the people that unfortunately are in a space of maybe not having climbed the corporate ladder, because I want to look at it in a balanced way, it's very likely they've literally gone through quite some trauma that their body is in total shutdown.
Both stories exist, but mainstream media repeatedly only spotlights one. The one where the immigrant appears stuck in a free state, exhausted, dependent, waiting. But of course, you don't need to be someone who's experienced displacement for stress to impact you that way.
When I quit my corporate job, my body was in desperate need for rest. I was literally asleep through the days, and I was very worried about it because it was just like, how can I need this much sleep? And thank goodness I was working with a trauma-informed coach, and she was like, Tanya, you need to surrender to the needs of your body. You need to rest as much as your body needs. You will know when it's finished resting. Your nervous system is resetting, because I was kind of living with trauma drive. You know, this force that pushes us to be productive is often motivated from a space of scarcity or pressure.
There's a lot that can throw our brains into overwhelm. Things such as financial stress, growing up in a chaotic family, being in economic uncertainty in the age of social media. During a stress response, the nervous system shuts down the capacity for many things as it concentrates on survival. When shutdown happens in a work context, for example, it could easily look like laziness. But organizational psychologist Dr. Annette Towler says that, quote, things like increased absenteeism and lack of work being delivered on time are more likely due to signs of employee bullying or mismanagement. Similarly, when we lose work or struggle finding it in the first place, it also comes with a lot of stories of making that failure personal.
Even that word, unemployed, it's a weighty, almost emotionally charged word. There's this assumption of what someone unemployed might be like. You know, this kind of lazy, doesn't want to work, doesn't want to contribute to society. Many of them, not everybody, but many of them kind of feel a sense of pressure, shame. I have to get out of this position. I'm not allowed to be here. I need to contribute. I have never met anyone that's like, I'm just going to chill. I don't want to work. I don't want to do anything. I mean, they're out there, of course. This is my experience. The general consensus, I would say, of people want to feel valuable. You know, I don't think there's people out there that's like, I don't want to feel like I'm of value to society.
I asked Tanya what actually happens in a therapy and coaching room for people.
So a lot of the people that I'm working with are like, I need help to be productive. I just want to be more productive. I don't like that I'm not doing anything right now. I need to set my goals, create a routine. I need to go, 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 go. But all of their behaviors are not on board with this mental concept of productivity. Their body says the opposite. On a cognitive level, they know what they want, but their body is tired, they're exhausted. They might be in like a freeze where they're not doing anything physically. Like usually laziness is a physical response, right? It's being immobile, being in a rest state.
So it's a normal response to...
Totally normal response. Totally, especially for everyone that is going through burnout. You need to rest. We've come to believe that when we are in this rest state, we're lazy. But actually, it's the rest state that allows us to reflect on what it is we really want to be productive with. Most people don't have the space or the resources to try to understand what that reason is that the procrastination is showing up. The thing that I notice with most people that are sort of stuck in this place, they have an inner contradiction. There's what they're told to do, and that's what they're in resistance to, but they don't have an alternative. Their true calling from their true selves, it's so suppressed. It's never been allowed the space to express itself, to come out. And much of the time, that direction isn't supported by their environment, by their peers, by the relationships in their lives. So part of them wants to kind of fulfill what they think they're supposed to do. But deep down, there's another part that is like, no, hell no, I cannot do that. And that suppression of that alternate path, I think, can lead to depression, can lead to apathy, or can just lead to feeling defeated, actually. People can have this sense like, where's my place in the world? What is my value? And it's not that it's not there. Often it's just never been supported. This is another good reframing question. How is the procrastination supporting you? How is the procrastination serving you? And once you change that frame, a whole lot comes out. There's so much understanding, so much clarity arises, actually, when you take the time to not resist.
What Tanya said made me think a lot about points in my own life where I was paralyzed by decisions I had to make about my future. Do I really want to go back to work that I know through repeated experience just doesn't work for me and causes me to burn out? What would even be an alternative, and where do I start looking? What would happen if we really understood what is going on with ourselves? Would the people around us be able to genuinely support us more instead of misunderstand us?
I'm just thinking of someone I'd met. She's German, and they have a Ukrainian refugee living in one of the rooms, and she's depressed. She's really depressed. Obviously, she's fled war. She's unemployed. She doesn't have a job, and this person that I'd come into contact with, she was quite bothered by it, and her solution to that was she needs to get German lessons. And she was sort of saying, every day I come home and I sort of say to her, have you signed up for German lessons yet? And so she's kind of adding this pressure onto her. And the way that she spoke to me about it was she was annoyed. She even sort of said, we all go to work. I have to get up at 5 a.m. to go to work. This is what she was saying. And, I come home and she's just there doing nothing. And it's interesting when you hear people talking about others that are unemployed, because it very much speaks to their own relationship with their work, but they tend to project it onto others. I'm creating some understanding for her. She's stressed. She's having a hard time going to work every day. And here she is seeing someone who's not at work, who's getting Social Security. And obviously deep down, she's like, this is unfair. And in a way, it is unfair because she might actually want that herself, but is disallowing herself from having it. And I could see that in her. She was exhausted. She was probably on a path of burnout herself from working so hard, and maybe a job that she was dissatisfied with, but didn't see an alternative.
An internalization of being hardworking also harms the people who believe in it. I think back to the Malaysian Chinese cultural narrative of hard work, in contrast to others, and how it's led so many people I know to go above and beyond and ignore personal limits. A strong belief in one's hardworking nature might make it challenging to accept moments of vulnerability when we really need to give it to ourselves, or when we really need to engage with others differently about where they are.
When we think about individuals that are triggered or activated or have difficulty accepting people that are currently being supported by the system, it's not about the person being supported by the system. It's about the person that has the problem with the person being supported by the system. And that's also where maybe we can create some understanding for one another. When you come across an individual like this, it might be a moment to be like, hey, are you okay? Are you under pressure? Are you stressed out? Do you have enough support?
Most of the time, these stories remain unconscious and never challenged. I think about something called the system's justification theory. When a system is hurting us, we often cope by convincing ourselves that it's fair, that the struggle is normal, necessary. And through this dissonance, people end up defending the very systems that hurt them because it's the only option they know of how to live. I think about all the people who oppose the idea of welfare, helping others, giving people more chances, if underneath there's actually this personal story of deservingness that gets twisted into something much less compassionate. On a systemic level, it's not just people like this that influence political will. The systems that try to help, like social work itself, often isn't designed either to really meet people where they're at. For example, in Germany, the unemployment scheme gives people money, but punishes them when they don't show up to meetings. In the UK, 80% of resources that social services get are spent on gatekeeping and bureaucracy, managing the queue, referring individuals from service to service, on recording every interaction to ensure that no one is responsible for those who inevitably fall through the cracks. In the US, significant spending is also spent on auditing and enforcement. Of course, this is not an advocation for scrapping social systems. They are incredibly important. But these approaches can often box people in and create situations where they don't actually receive the help they need or leave them worse off. It doesn't actually reflect the multitude of challenges that people face while they are in life transitions, vulnerable circumstances, and economic uncertainty. Our next guest has a lot to say about this.
When I think about the lack of compassion, I see that people have been suffering for a long time, right? Our society, even when you go into schools, right? Like we force our kids to learn a certain way and to sit in these rows. And then when you don't sit in these rows, we label you and we say that you have ADHD and all these different types of things.
That's Felipe Mercado, a professor of social work at Fresno State University in the US. He's a therapist and the founder of Wise Soul CC. I spoke to Felipe because he has strong feelings about compassion, also in social work.
I always challenge my social workers, how would you like it if somebody came in and labeled you? with something, opposed to having compassion and listening to them, and then understanding the weights of the world, understanding that there's racism, understanding that there's all these isms that people have to go through that create intersectionality and can create hardships and microaggressions.
How did you come to encounter this question?
For me, it's been an interesting journey. I got kicked out at 14 years old, so I didn't go to traditional school. I went to juvenile hall, and I found myself homeless from about 14 to 19 years old. And things were really difficult during these times. I grew up in poverty, and I never really saw that the way that I was growing up really shaped the way that I saw life. But, I never thought that I was good enough. I never felt like I belonged. And it was like this voice in the back of my head that always kind of kept me back. It wasn't until I got a little bit older that I found mentors that were helping me with that voice. And I started to see what I had inside, that society has kind of told me that I didn't have these things inside of me. I really started to step into my life. And what I saw as curses when I was younger, such as my dad being addicted to drugs, or my mom having mental health issues, or being homeless, all these things actually became blessings later on in life because it gave me insight to extreme struggle, to why things happen the way that they happen in my community. And that really amplified what I wanted to do in my community. And so I had found this training in Stanford called compassion cultivation training. And I realized that compassion was one of these skills that I never really learned. It's like you get this medicine and you want to share it. For me, that's what compassion was. It was this medicine that changed my life.
So there's so many people who always blame the problems in society on the most vulnerable. Then they'll go on to say things like social work and welfare systems don't work. But what you're saying is like this deeper thing, that the system itself is not compassionate.
Yes. And not even for social workers, right? When I became a social worker, I had to learn child welfare. And after I graduated, I would have to work for 2 years for the county in order to pay back $40,000 that they gave me. A lot of people don't have money. So when you see $40,000, you're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of money. So I'm a student sitting in class, and I'm learning all these concepts, and I might have had these life experiences, and I want to go out there and help people. And I just went through 2 years of not getting paid, right? I might have a family, and I went through this program. Now I'm going in, and I have to give 2-year payback in this system where I get no overtime, where I get paid maybe, $50,000 a year, and they're running me into the ground. And we're really getting paid by removing families, because the child welfare system, right? They're providing family services, not by healing families. So then as a social worker, I'm going in and I'm like, oh my gosh, I want to go and help these people, but my job is to do an assessment to see if you have neglect, if there's any emotional abuse, right? I have to, follow these codes. And if I don't do it, then I'm going to lose my job. And so there becomes this dissonance where I can continue to do what my job asks me to do. So I could have a job, but in my heart, I don't feel like this is good. This is why when I got into my profession, it was very hard for me, right? And it was hard for a lot of my peers because we all had these hearts and the system didn't have a heart.
Are you trying to work on this as an educator too? Because I hear the frustration of this is the reality that my students will have to go through.
I think it's important for us as social workers to start to create a curriculum that is more practical and reality-based. So rather than having students writing papers, we need students to go out into the community and actually start doing things. A compassionate social worker, in a nutshell, basically really helps people understand that their label isn't what they are. What that means is, when somebody is coming in with the conditions of laziness, per se, what are all the good things that they have going on in their life? Like if you showed up today, that's like a huge strength, right? Most of the people that are considered lazy or procrastinators wouldn't show up. What are the healing modalities in life? One of the biggest things that I think from my practice is connection and authenticity. I think a lot of us feel trauma or disconnected from a lack of connection. So maybe, I'm connected to my mom or my dad, but when I'm around my mom or my dad, I can't really tell them my deepest and my darkest feelings or what I really, really think. I have to kind of let them know what they want me to be like, right? And I can't really let them know who I want to be. And so I think if we can start to look at healing from a place of how do we connect? How do we help someone that's in my office be you, because then you get that realignment and you didn't have it before. And that's where healing happens, right? Because if you think that I'm procrastinating, but in reality, maybe I don't know how to do it, I'm scared, I have a fear of failing, am I really procrastinating? I don't know if people are going to like what I have to say, but people inside already have the answers to heal themselves in a funny way. And that might take a lot of people out of business, right? If someone comes into your practice and you're helping people make sense of their life and they're able to make sense of these things, then as a social workers, all we're doing is connecting them to resources. And as they're doing all the other work, it's really them and their efficacy that's developing, right? And they're going to the services now because now they're seeing life in a different perspective. But you provided that space that no one else ever provided for them to have connection, for them to have authenticity, that develop trust. I think that a lot of times we forget that we are the medicine.
There is something that is rarely addressed in the context around achieving our goals, and that is authenticity. Living in alignment with our true values, where we are and who we want to become. For example, if there is a desire to quit your job, to leave your university, leave a relationship that is doing you disservice, to explore something else that might actually be more aligned with what you want. Psychologists have found that authenticity helps individuals by creating a sense of congruence between their inner beliefs and outward actions. This alignment leads to greater self-esteem, better relationships, and a reduction in this internal conflict. It's simply just easier to go ahead with pursuing something if all the parts of us genuinely want to go towards it. But of course, this is not accessible to everyone at any given moment. We do live in a society and have financial and relational obligations. It seems harder than ever to predict what will happen next and to have agency in this world. So, what would happen if we didn't just assign labels to people, but understood where they were coming from? What kinds of conversations and opportunities can we open up? There is so much that needs to be retold about our relationship with what we call laziness. So whether you struggle with it yourself, have someone in your life who may be stuck, I hope this episode poses some questions that are helpful and that are kind. What's going on beneath everyone who is stuck, and what would actually lift them up, is often more complicated and simple than what meets the surface. I'd love to imagine a world where we can actually support ourselves in the ways we need, and I hope this helps you a little bit too. What other economic norms need to be reevaluated? And what happens when they get weaponized? That's next time. This project is supported by the Network for Social Change and the Post-Growth Institute. This episode was produced and edited by Marta Medvesek and me, Miho Soon, featuring an original score by Bartu Kulha and other royalty-free contributors. To dive deeper into the topics discussed and learn more about our guests and contributors, please refer to the show notes or visit our website at moneytrauma.org. This episode cites work by Dr. Syed Hussein Alatas, Dr. Devin Price, Annette Towler, Clara Imate, and Hilary Cottom. I'm really grateful to have spoken to Jonathan Yong Tienxhi, Tanya Master, and Felipe Mercado. Special thanks to Jeremy Lim for connecting me with the right people. Thank you for listening, and see you next time.